Hello YouTube, Sidekick here, with another video about the F4, but maybe a little bit different than the last few that I have made. I've been spending a lot of time in the F4 learning how to use its air-to-ground weapons, and I think I'm starting to understand it, at least a little. I've also found some excellent reading material in a book, including a book called Sierra Hotel that I will link in the description that has sort of helped solidify some of my ideas about the F4. So I'm going to continue making videos about weapons delivery in the F4. But I thought it was maybe time to talk about, what's the F4 actually good for? And, by that I mean, what was the F4, specifically the F-4E, designed to do, and how was it actually used? And then to put that in the context of DCS, maybe by comparing it to some other aircraft of similar ages in DCS, basically try to figure out how we can use the F4 in, if not realistic, at least sort of historically credible ways, let's say. But I'm discovering that it's not exactly what I thought it would be. Although I probably should have known, based on its history. With that in mind, why don't we take a quick look at the history of the F4 Phantom II. Now, the F4 actually started out life as the F-4H in the old numbering system because development was actually started before 1962 and by the Navy. Now, the Navy was actually looking for an aircraft that was designed to be a fleet defense fighter, meaning it was designed for air-to-air work at high altitude and high speed and long range. Now, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy, famously or infamously, forced the Air Force to share the F-4H design with the Navy. Now, the Air Force initially called it the F-110, so in some cases, in some senses, the F-4 Phantom is actually kind of the end point of the Century series of aircraft that the Air Force developed in the 1950s. And that's kind of actually important to note, and we'll get to why in a minute. Now, the Air Force did not want another interceptor at the time. It already had those. What the Air Force wanted was a tactical fighter capable of performing the deep strike role. And it's important to remember, when the Air Force said strike, they meant nuclear. And when they said fighter, they didn't mean an aircraft designed to go into combat against other aircraft. So, in a sense, the F-4 was one of, really, the first multi-role aircraft, because McDonnell Aircraft was forced to take a design that was intended to be a long-range interceptor and also turn it into a long-range nuclear strike aircraft. The important thing to remember in all of this is that no one ever expected the F-4 Phantom to fill a classic close air support or ground attack role. I mean, yes, it was designed to deliver air-to-ground weapons, but it was designed to do them deep behind enemy lines, and those weapons were expected to have nuclear warheads, which importantly meant that they didn't really they needed to be delivered at significant range, and they didn't really need to be delivered with anything like pinpoint accuracy. I started to realize this when I actually looked at the way the F-4E's cockpit is laid out. Now, bearing in mind that the E model was a later model, and there were lots of modifications, including ones to make the delivery of conventional weapons easier and more accurate, but still, the cockpit still clearly shows the hallmarks of being designed for an aircraft that was meant to fulfill a deep nuclear strike role. I mean, look at the weapons delivery mode dial. It actually has two halves. The left-hand side of the dial, called the altitude reference and bombing computer, is actually for delivery modes that were almost certainly intended for the delivery of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, the right-hand side of the dial is for the weapons release bombing computer, or accurate modes, which is basically designed for what I would call classic iron bombing. Now, you can see this by noticing, first of all, that the middle button is actually labeled nuclear jettison, for heaven's sakes. But if you stop to think about it, you'll see that the modes on the left-hand side of the dial, loft, over the shoulder, timed level, have one thing in common. They all require a certain amount, sometimes actually a great deal, of planning prior to flight. In these modes, the Wizzo has a very important responsibility to act effectively as a navigator. He has to help the pilot find and fly some very specific points over the ground so that together they can deliver the weapons on time, on target. These are not modes that would be planned in the cockpit and would not be used against targets of opportunity. And this clearly reflects the philosophy behind deep strike, whether they're nuclear or whether they're conventional. And as I said, that's what the Air Force wanted when it asked for the F-4. And let's be clear, when the F-4 was designed, the only deep strike mission that the United States Air Force contemplated was the nuclear one, because we're talking about the late 1950s here. And when the F-4 was first deployed to Europe, not to Vietnam, the job it was given was nuclear strike. Pilots at the time reported that one of their main jobs was, quite literally, either sitting in their aircraft or sitting in a hardened shelter with their aircraft, preparing to fly out and perform a nuclear strike mission if the balloon went up suddenly. So why does this matter? Why am I going on about it? Well, because I think that when you go out and put the F-4 into missions in DCS, it's important to remember what it was designed to be good at, and what it was not designed to be good at. I mean, it doesn't mean that it can't be used in roles for which it wasn't designed, but it's not a natural home for the F-4. If you really want to employ the F-4 the way it was designed to be used, and then, in the case of the E model, kind of redesigned to be used, I think you do need to take this stuff into account. So what do I mean by that? Well, what does designed to do mean in the context of DCS? What I mean is that the F-4 was designed to penetrate air defenses at low level and high speed, very similar to the F-105 before it. It was designed to perform a single attack, often starting at low level, whether climbing and then diving, or delivering the ordnance during the climb, or delivering the ordnance at low level. Either way, it was designed to make one pass on the target and no more. Even when used in a non-nuclear role, this is still what the F-4 is good at. And that's because, to perform this role, it not only had to have the flying characteristics that it has, great speed, a huge amount of power, the ability to carry a massive ordnance load, the F-4 also has the avionics to do the job. Well, what was at the time when it was developed really a world-class radar system and a world-class INS navigation system, and a second crewman to operate both of those things. So its real strength was its ability to get to a point remote from its base accurately and on time and through enemy air defenses, which were expected to be dense at places along the way. In DCS terms, what does that sound like? Well, honestly, it kind of sounds like the Viggen, but I will get to that, maybe not in this video, but in a later one. But now I'm going to talk a bit more about some specific comparisons to other DCS aircrafts in a minute, but the important thing at this point here is to realize that the F-4's mission, as it was originally envisioned, is very similar to the mission that the Viggen was actually specifically designed to do, and you know what I mean if you've ever flown the Viggen. And I think it's kind of important to think of it that way. The F-4 was designed for its ground attack role to perform a deep strike, low-level, high-speed penetration mission with a single attack at the end, and then it was designed to get out of town in a hurry. Now, the difference between the F-4 and the HA-37 is that the F-4 was designed to do it with nuclear weapons, which meant that it had a much higher payload and much more sophisticated tools for those ARBC delivery modes. More importantly, well, let's talk about what the F-4 wasn't designed to do. Well, it wasn't designed to loiter around the battlefield performing precise attacks against point targets in close contact with friendly troops on the ground. In other words, it wasn't designed to be a close air support aircraft. Now, it did get used that way in Vietnam, particularly by the United States Marine Corps, but that experience kind of exposed its limitations in that mission, and honestly, I think, was one of the things responsible for the changes that were implemented in the E model, particularly the later soft-wing version that Hitler has actually modeled. To make the point a bit more concretely, let's take a look at how the F-4 actually does compared to some other aircraft that you might be familiar with in DCS, particularly some of the aircraft of the same era. Now, arguably, that era for the F-4E actually includes the early models of the F-16, maybe even the F-18, but of course we don't have early models of the 16 or the 18 in DCS, so you have to be careful about comparing the F-4E and DCS to either one of those jets. And I'm not really going to include the DCS versions of those aircraft in this little analysis, since I really think they are the next generation of fighter design for many reasons, both aerodynamic and avionic. So let's talk about the aircraft that the F-4 actually served alongside from, say, the very late 1960s to the early 80s, which was when the F-4E was the main Phantom variant. Now, I'm mostly going to focus on the United States here. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about Israel eventually, but one of the issues with the F-4 is that it's used by so many different air forces in a lot of different roles, and that it's kind of hard to keep track of, honestly. But let's just stick with the U.S. experience and how it was used compared to other craft that we have in DCS, because, of course, the U.S. was the primary user of the F-4, and how it used the aircraft kind of shaped how most other countries did as well. Okay, so let's start with the Navy, which was the original customer for the F-4. How did the Navy use the F-4? Well, frankly, almost exclusively in the Fleet Defender Interceptor role. And then in Vietnam in a variety of combat air patrol roles, but basically where it was charged with protecting strike aircraft from interference from enemy aircraft. The Navy really didn't use the F-4 in a heavy attack role, at least not very much as far as I can tell. And that's because they had the A-4, and then the A-7 and the A-6 to perform their attack role. Now, they didn't call it strike, they called it attack. So the F-4 wasn't really an attack jet in Navy service. If there are those of you out there who know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the Navy squadrons that flew the F-4 were designated as fighter and not as fighter attack squadrons. Now, the Marine Corps, on the other hand, did use F-4 squadrons that were designated as FA or fighter attack squadrons. So, in U.S. Marine Corps service, it was used as a heavy attack aircraft, and that's basically because the Marines do not, and have never, had the need for an aircraft that can't support troops on the ground. Now, of course, the Marine Corps had other attack aircraft at the time, and that was the A-4, which the Marines didn't replace with the A-7, unlike the Navy. The A-4 was actually not replaced until it was replaced by the Harrier. So the F-4 and the A-4 served alongside each other in the Corps for almost 2 decades. Now, I've been looking for, but have not found, a lot of information on how the F-4 squadrons were employed by the Marines as compared to how they used their A-4 squadrons, particularly in Vietnam. Now, during Vietnam, there does not seem to be a whole lot of distinction in the missions that the two types of aircraft flew. They were both used, mostly, to provide close air support to troops on the ground inside South Vietnam. Usually that was under the direction of a forward air controller, airborne or otherwise, and usually in a fairly low-threat air defense environment, one in which the primary threat was small arms fire, which was a significant threat, but it only really existed very close to the ground, obviously. Now, of course, if you're going to put the F-4 in Marine colors in Vietnam, it's important to note that the Corps did not fly the E model in Vietnam. That does make a bit of a difference, because the B model that they did fly was actually even less suited than the E was for the role that it played in Vietnam. Overall, the A-4 was honestly a better platform for the kind of work the Marines had to do, which is probably why the Marines could not be convinced to give the A-4 up after the war. If there was any logic to the way the two aircraft, the F-4 and the A-4, were employed, I'd bet that the F-4s got more of the jobs that required deeper penetration into rear areas, like the border regions with Laos and Cambodia, doing more of the battlefield interdiction tasks. The S-4s would have been a good choice for that, because any job that needed a lot of ordnance delivered in a hurry was a good job for the F-4, especially if it didn't need to be delivered with pinpoint precision. It's a question that interests me, though. I'm trying to find more information, so if you have any, let me know. And do expect there's going to be some more videos on the subject of Marine Corps use of the F-4 in the future. Now, the Air Force, on the other hand, did intend to use the F-4 in a ground attack role, but as I've been saying, they intended it for a deep strike mission. And initially, when they bought the aircraft in the early 1960s, that was a nuclear mission, as I've been saying. And the F-4 was a nuclear strike fighter, and its crews were trained to be nuclear strike crews. Although that doctrine was to have very serious consequences in Vietnam, for which see my podcast on the history of iron bombing, the experience in Vietnam and the limitations that exposed in the original design was very much the rationale for the soft wing E model, which significantly improved the F-4's low-speed handling, as well as the human factors engineering of the cockpit, which simplified many aircrew tasks and which allowed the crew to react to changing situations in the cockpit. Again, suiting it more to a multi-role, close air support, target of opportunity kind of tasking. And this focus on making the F-4 a true multi-role fighter stemmed from the fact that effectively that's how it was used by the Air Force in Vietnam. The F-4 started out as a replacement for the F-105 in Vietnam. Actually, the F-105 was actually withdrawn from service in the middle of the Vietnam War, and its role was taken over by the F-4. So the core of this role in Vietnam, though, was attacking North Vietnamese infrastructure targets deep inside enemy territory in the face of advanced and significant air defenses. In other words, even though the missions were performed by fighters from a tactical air force, it was pretty reminiscent of the strategic bombing of the Second World War more than anything else. Now, alongside that role, F-4s were also used to provide MiG-CAP, combat air patrol, effectively bomber escort duties. However, the strategic bombing in North Vietnam was not the only ground attack role for the F-4. Other roles included what we would call battlefield interdiction, which basically means finding trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and bombing them. When the U.S. was not actively bombing North Vietnam, sort of between Operations Rolling Thunder and Linebacker, this was actually the main mission of the Thailand-based tactical fighter wings. So F-4 pilots spent a lot of time over Laos and Cambodia trying to find and destroy enemy vehicles on roads, both day and night, both as fast FACs, who found and marked the targets, and as the weapons delivery system that attempted to destroy them. The United States Air Force also employed the F-4 in South Vietnam-based squadrons, not just the Thai squadrons. Now, these squadrons were tasked with carrying out close air support missions similar to the role played by the Marine Corps squadrons. Again, this was not really a sweet spot for the F-4, and it was complemented throughout the war, first of all by F-100s and then A-1s that the Air Force acquired from the Navy. So if we're going to compare the F-4 to jets in Vietnam in the Air Force, it would have to be, well, the F-105, the F-100, or the A-1, none of which, sadly, exist as full-fidelity models in DCS. So that, kind of limits our options for multi-class mission making in DCS, although obviously there still are a wide choice of missions that could be simulated given, Vietnam missions that could be simulated given the variety of roles that the F-4 filled. Well, what about outside Vietnam? What about after Vietnam? What about the F-4 and the Cold War? Well, as I said, in the early days, it was deployed in Northwest Europe essentially as a nuclear strike fighter, and this role persisted, well into the 1970s. Now, as the NATO, or I should say the United States, planned response to Warsaw Pact aggression shifted from massive retaliation to flexible response, where they actually expected to meet and engage the Warsaw Pact in conventional conflict on the ground in West Germany, the F-4 started to get new roles. But it was joined by other aircraft, in particular by the A-7 and then by the A-10 and the F-111. Now, I think acquisition of the A-7 after Vietnam by the Air Force, and the later development of the A-10, which started at the end of the Vietnam War, can really be seen as a reaction to the limitations of aircraft like the F-4 in the close air support role. Both of these aircraft, the A-10 and the A-7, were ones that were intended for what I'll call tactical ground attack. So they were expected to take most of the tactical air attack roles. What was the F-4 supposed to do? Well, for at least part of the time, at least initially, it was moved to an air superiority role. And in some allied countries, it retained that air superiority role for a while. In the United States Air Force, though, it was largely replaced in that role by the F-15, and certainly by 1980, it was no longer the primary air superiority fighter in the United States Air Force. So I'm sure that F-4 squadrons still had ground attack missions, I haven't found exactly how their mission set was defined, though. But I suspect, mostly, that they were not intended to be used in a close air support role. I suspect that, again, they were mostly intended to perform a deep strike role, or, maybe I should say a medium strike, or maybe a heavy attack role. See, like, through the 70s and 80s, the Air Force had a range of aircraft for air-to-ground missions. For the real close-in work with the Army, they had the A-7, which was joined and then replaced by the A-10. For true deep penetration missions, they had the F-111, which was specifically designed for low-level, all-terrain, all-weather precision missions. The F-4 wasn't really designed for any of those things, although it could do some of it pretty well. So it really kind of fell in between the attack aircraft and the strike aircraft. And so I have to admit, it's a little bit of a mystery still to me exactly what an F-4 pilot in Northwest Europe in 1980 would have expected their job to be in a coming conflict. But if it was going to be given a role that played to the F-4's strengths, and let's face it, that's not a given, but let's assume that someone at least tried to give it a role that was well suited to it, would have been to hit pre-planned targets at pre-planned times with massive loads of ordnance. It would have been expected to be able to deliver those weapons with precision, but not pinpoint precision, mostly. In other words, its job would have been to take out things like headquarters or supply dumps and troop concentrations in second and third echelons. Let's say 20 to 50, maybe 70 kilometers behind the forward line of owned troops. It would have gone after targets that would have been clearly identified and located, probably by somebody else. These missions would have required precise navigation and flying, to follow prescribed routes and arrive on target and on time with a large load of ordnance. That was the job the F-4 could have done and done well. Now, the F-4 might also have been given tasks that required very high precision delivery, because the fact was that the F-4 could use the laser-guided bombs with the aid of pave spike. So it could hit hard and hard-to-hit targets like strategic bridges or bunkers that really couldn't be defeated easily with iron bombs. The only other aircraft in the Air Force that was really suited to delivering LGBs in the 70s and 80s anyways was the F-111, and there weren't very many of them, and they were likely to be reserved for deep penetration missions where their terrain-following radar and even more blinding speed than the F-4 would have been used to greatest advantage. So, again, if a high-value target was identified near the forward line of owned troops, and it required precision attack, the F-4 would probably have gotten the nod. But again, almost certainly these would have been pre-approved by a higher headquarters, and the mission would have been planned in detail prior to flight. LGBs were still not a very plentiful resource, even in the 1980s. Now, unfortunately, we don't have an F-111 in DCS, but we do have the A-10. So how can we put Phantoms and Hogs together on the DCS virtual battlefield? Well, as we've been finding out in our Balloon Goes Up project, the A-10 was very well suited to the role, a role around supporting troops, not necessarily by direct close air support, probably more by attacking enemy follow-on echelons and fire support. Now, unlike the F-4 or any fast jet, the A-10 was designed to make multiple passes on targets after loitering around the battlefield, doing its own reconnaissance and target identification and target prioritization. Thus, the A-10 had a very different kind of role than the F-4 did, but it was a role that I think, in the end was highly complementary to the F-4. So, how could you use the A-10 and the F-4 together in a scenario where they're both doing the jobs that they should have done? Well, I would say it would go something like this. You'd want to have the A-10s arrived and be performing their reconnaissance and battlefield interdiction roles, which essentially means finding the enemy. Now, sometimes they're going to find especially large concentrations of enemy, and sometimes those concentrations are going to be very high-value targets, like headquarters or vehicle concentrations in an assembly or resupply area, or deployed artillery, especially long-range rocket artillery in the divisional artillery groups. In other words, sometimes the Hogs would be finding large, high-value targets that were really not what they were good at engaging, targets that needed to be engaged decisively in one single strike, so they couldn't get away, In all likelihood, they would then report those locations up the chain through AWACS or GCI or JSTARS or whatever. But if the targets were juicy enough, those locations might very well be turned into targeting information for a more appropriate resource, which would have been a flight of F-4s. It might have even been sent to a quick reaction flight on a runway or at the side of a runway somewhere. Now, those F-4s would get the information, including where the target was, when they were supposed to attack it, what route they were supposed to take to get there. They would have a planned attack that was appropriate for the target and the weapons they were carrying. It's conceivable, if the F-4s were stationed close enough to the front, they might even arrive to deliver that strike while the A-10s were still in the area. Now, that's probably stretching it a little bit, but you could do it in DCS. Might not be entirely credible, but it's not so impossible you couldn't do it that way. So, effectively, the hog drivers would be out doing the hog driver thing, flying around, finding the enemy, locating the really big, juicy targets that were not the ones they wanted to take on, and then passing that info on to the F-4s, who would then arrive at high speed, at low altitude, and perform either a laydown attack or a loft bombing attack, or a pop-up and dive toss attack. Either way, the F-4s would arrive with a massive load of ordnance. Remember, each one of them can carry 24 Mark 82 bombs. And they would then plaster a high-value target like an artillery concentration or an assembly point for vehicles or a large divisional headquarters or something like that. And then they would disappear in a puff of afterburner smoke. And the A-10s would carry on cleaning up the mess they left behind. I think that's a credible use of the F-4E DCS with an aircraft that it likely would have collaborated with or cooperated with in real life. And by the way, that's probably something that we'll try to recreate in our little project called The Balloon Goes Up that we're running on my Discord server. And now that's focused on the A-10 to date, partly because I haven't figured out until now how the F-4 and the A-10 would work together. But I think the scenario that I described is one that'll work. And I think that's one we're probably going to be working on. So, drop by the Discord channel if you want to know more about that. Okay, look, there's quite a bit more to say on this topic actually, including delving into other missions in other scenarios involving things like the A4, the Marine Corps, the Israeli Air Force, the Kola map, maybe even the Vigan. But that's probably way more than enough for now. This has gone on for a while. Let me know if you'd like to hear more about these realistic, or at least historically credible ways to use the F-4E in DCS. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon, and this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.